Welcome back to Historic Rugby at Home, everyone. I'm Jordan Hewitt, your host, and today we are going to learn about two of Historic Rugby's most memorable and interesting characters, Aunt Dicie and Aunt Lizzie Fletcher. Dicie Fletcher and Lizzie Fletcher were two of 6 children born to Jesse and Nancy Oxford Fletcher of Lee County, Virginia. The Fletcher family moved to Tennessee before the Civil War period. Their father, Jesse Fletcher, drowned on a trip back to the family home place in Virginia, but their mother, Nancy Fletcher, died in 1897 and is buried in Laureldale Cemetery. Aunt Dicie and Aunt Lizzie, as they were known, were two of rugby's most interesting local characters. Rather than marry and have families of their own, they decided to live by themselves independently and live their own lives. Aunt Dicie was a notable weaver of textiles. She made coverlets, she made couch covers, she made different woven pieces and was able to create her own patterns, but also imitate English patterns that she saw that the colonists had here in Rugby. At the time of her death, her work was in 24 states and several European countries. The April 17, 1902 edition of the Fentress County Gazette said this: "Rugby will be represented in the Arts and Crafts of Tennessee exhibition to be held in Knoxville this week by some of Miss Dicie Fletcher's weaving. The fame of her work has spread even beyond the state, and she is at present pushed to fill her orders. Every stranger coming to Rugby desires to carry away with him some of her beautiful work, as the art of hand weaving has almost disappeared in our country. 2 beautiful couch covers in red and blue will be on exhibition, and the committee will give them a prominent place. Her work is for sale at the Newberry and Perigo hotels." A dozen of Aunt Dicie's pieces are in the Cincinnati Art Museum today. Aunt Lizzie raised farm animals and flowers on her property, which is now in the Beacon Hill community here in historic Rugby. Aunt Lizzie was known as a fine singer of English ballads, which her ancestors had brought from the British Isles to America. Both of the Fletcher sisters were well educated. They could quote Shakespeare and Robert Burns and other classic authors. Patricia Whitman, who grew up in Rugby after the turn of the century, remembered Aunt Dicie and Aunt Lizzie and recorded her memories of these two ladies before the end of her life. She had this to say:
"The years I spent in Rugby were when I was a very small child, and it was my great pleasure to be allowed to go visit Aunt Lizzie and Aunt Dicie. Aunt Dicie lived in a 1-roomed house filled to overflowing with all sorts of fascinating things. There was a large bed, table, chairs, several dog boxes, at least 1 or 2 setting hens, and in the middle of all this, a large wooden loom on which she wove the linsey woolsey for her dresses, bedspreads, table covers, and any number of things. She was always most obliging in demonstrating this loom. She would, with a great deal of grunting and complaining about her rheumatiz, climb up on the stool in the center of the framework, and like a plump, withered brown spider set the huge loom in motion, her shuttle flying back and forth, and her feet working the wooden pedals. Some of her patterns were truly beautiful. Once she made Father a chessboard on her loom, but unfortunately the white squares were on the wrong corners. However, we loved it for the giver, and it always brought pleasant memories of Aunt Dicie when we looked at it. She was such a cheerful, happy-go-lucky somebody that I'm sure Rugby was never the same after she left it. Aunt Lizzie was tall and lean and lived beside Aunt Dicie in a neat little cottage surrounded by neat flower beds and palings. Aunt Lizzie, for some reason, was possessed of an austerity which caused us little folks to stand in awe of her, so as a rule we did not tarry long at her house, but after thanking her politely, hurried over to Aunt Dicie's to take a last look at the latest flock of new chickens or litter of puppies, or gather a nosegay from the hodgepodge of flowers growing at random around her door.
Aunt Dicie died in 1913 of Brice's disease. At her request, she was buried under a cedar tree not too far from her house in what is now private land in the Beacon Hill community. Aunt Lizzie died in 1926 and is buried in Laureldale Cemetery next to their mother. Aunt Lizzie is remembered today by the beautiful flowers that adorn the spot where her house stood in the Beacon Hill community. Aunt Dicie is remembered today by the beautiful pieces that are in the Historic Rugby collection and also the Cincinnati Art Museum. These two hardworking ladies made the best life for themselves here in Rugby, and they are part of the reason that Rugby is one of the greatest places on earth. Join us again next week for another edition of Historic Rugby at Home. Thank you.